This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to remix a story you probably think you know inside and out, the origin of Western philosophy. We're about to challenge one of the most foundational beliefs about where our big ideas actually come from. And trust me, the answer is probably not what you're expecting. You've probably heard this famous quote from the philosopher Hegel. It just perfectly sums up the classic story, right? This idea that Western thought is this one, unbroken line that starts with the ancient Greeks. We're taught to see them as our intellectual ancestors, and their world as our spiritual home. But what if that whole homecoming idea is just a story we told ourselves? What if the Greeks weren't the foundation of our intellectual house at all? What if they were more like a disruptive, maybe even dangerous technology that we imported long after the house was already built? So where do we start our investigation? Well, it begins with a really simple, almost obvious problem. For that story of a direct line from Greece to us to be true, you kind of need the books. And for centuries, Western Europe just didn't have them. You know the story they teach you in school, right? It's this beautiful, clean line, this golden chain of thought passed down from Athens all the way to us. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, these names are supposed to be the absolute bedrock of our entire intellectual tradition. Okay, now this is where that popular story just completely falls apart. Before the 12th century, the Latin West, they knew the names of the great Greeks, but they didn't really know their ideas. Socrates was seen as a moral saint, not really a philosopher. Plato was only known through this really distorted, mystical lens. And Aristotle, he was almost a complete ghost, except for a few tiny bits of his work on logic. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. For over 700 years, right during the time when Western European thought was really taking shape, the main works of Plato and Aristotle just weren't being read. There was no continuous line. There was a huge, gaping hole in history. So if the Greeks weren't the ones laying the foundation, then who was? This massive gap in the historical record points us in a totally different direction, toward the real architect of Western thought. I mean, think about it. Who was the actual builder of the Western mind? If the blueprint for our entire way of thinking didn't come from Athens, then where on earth did it come from? Well, the answer is one single, absolutely towering figure who basically shaped European thought for 1,000 years. His name was Augustine of Hippo. And listen, he wasn't trying to continue some Greek tradition. He was creating something brand new. He used the materials he had around him, Christian scripture, Roman culture, and a really transformed version of Platonism, and he built an entirely new framework for how to think. And the framework he built? It was nothing short of revolutionary. He gave us this idea of interiority, the focus on your inner self, your consciousness. He gave us the idea of linear time, that history is a line moving toward a specific goal. And with that, the idea that history actually has a purpose. These concepts feel so natural to us now, but they were not central to the classical Greeks. They were Augustine's invention. And this is the key right here. Augustine's world was not Plato's Athens, not even close. It was the late Roman Empire, a world where the Greek texts were super rare and the whole cultural landscape had just completely changed. He was a product of his own time, not a revivalist of a much older one. Now, this Augustinian way of thinking, it wasn't just some flash in the pan. Nope, it was the beginning of this massive intellectual project that would define the West for 1,400 years. And it all culminates with a philosopher we've actually already met. So check out this timeline. It shows exactly when these Greek tools finally showed up on the scene. For centuries, the West was just chugging along on its own Augustinian path. Then, bam, into 12th century, Aristotle's works get imported through Arabic translations, and suddenly there's a whole new language for logic. Then, 3 centuries later, Plato's complete works finally arrive from the collapsing Byzantine Empire. These were powerful additions, for sure, but they were not the foundation. And this is the grand finale. That whole long Augustinian project, it all comes to a head with Hegel. And when you put them side by side, the parallels are just, wow, they're stunning. Hegel basically took Augustine's entire religious structure and just translated it into secular philosophy. God's plan became the world spirit. Salvation history became the idea of history as progress. The inner self became self-consciousness. It's the exact same blueprint, just with new names. So at the end of the day, Hegel wasn't a return to Greece at all. He was the ultimate fulfillment, the final, souped-up version of the project Augustine began. He closed the loop on a system that was always, deep down, teleological. All right, so if Hegel basically put the final bow on this 1400-year project, where does that leave a guy like Nietzsche? Well, his popular role as the great destroyer of philosophy is, let's just say, it's widely misunderstood. He wasn't some revolutionary attacking a mighty fortress. We have this image of Nietzsche, right? The rebel, the lone genius with a giant hammer, just smashing the idols and tearing down this huge castle of philosophy. It's a very romantic story. But the reality, it's a lot less dramatic. By the time Nietzsche showed up on the scene, Hegel's big philosophical system was already a pile of rubble. Political changes, infighting among his students, the castle had already collapsed from the inside. And that brings us to maybe the most famous and most misunderstood 3 words in all of philosophy. God is dead. This wasn't some triumphant battle cry. It wasn't a call to arms. It was something way more matter-of-fact. Think of it this way. Nietzsche wasn't the murderer who killed God or the big philosophical system that had replaced God. He was the coroner. He was the guy who showed up at the crime scene, examined the body, and just wrote down the official cause of death. He was simply reporting on something that had already happened. So his whole project wasn't about tearing things down. It was about what comes after. With that huge, meaning-giving structure of the last 1400 years totally gone, his work was really an attempt to answer one desperate, vital question. In a world without a divine plan or a grand historical purpose, how in the world are we supposed to live? So, looking at history this way completely flips the script on how we see Greek philosophy. It wasn't our origin story. It was a tool. So, what's the big takeaway here? The Greeks aren't our intellectual homeland. That's the myth. The reality is that their philosophy was more like a foreign toolbox, a powerful alien technology that was imported late into a culture built on a totally different foundation. And just like any radical new tech, its arrival was disruptive. It fundamentally changed the world it entered. Once you see this, it changes how you look at our entire intellectual history. It forces you to question all those neat, tidy stories we get told. And it leaves us with one last pretty provocative question. If the origin story of Western philosophy itself is basically a myth, what other histories that we just accept as true are also long overdue for a remix?
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.